So, very good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of SHM, I would like to welcome you all at this important webinar on 3 years of GST, key open legal issues and points arising out of COVID scenario. We all know that GST in India has completed 3 years yesterday. So, since its onset in India on 1st July 2017, GST has proved to be a roller coaster ride for all the stakeholders, including taxpayers and government authorities, as it has witnessed numerous changes in each and every aspect of legislation. Further, various COVID-19 as well as related measures have also added a layer of complexity. Moreover, ongoing court decisions and advanced rulings are also changing the GST landscape. Therefore, SOCHM in association with Dhruva Advisors LLP is organizing this webinar. The webinar will cover a broad discussion on 3 years of GST with a focus on key open legal issues that need government attention, discussion on current litigation trend, key advanced ruling which have further larger issues than resolving the same. Now, before we start the webinar, let me give you a very brief introduction of the three speakers that we have today. We have Mr. Ritesh Kanodia, who is a co-chairman of SOCHM National Council on Indirect Taxes and partner Dhruva Advisor LLP. He has over 18 years of experience and is a qualified lawyer and a chartered accountant. Along with his in-depth expertise in indirect taxes, his areas of proficiency include foreign trade policy as well as export control legislation. He regularly advises clients on indirect tax structuring and supply chain optimization and has advised various domestic and multinational companies on tax controversies, including devising pre-litigation strategies. Then we have Mr. Neeraj Bagri, partner Dhruva Advisor LLP. He is a chartered accountant and has more than 18 years of experience in the field of indirect tax advisory, consulting and litigation. He specializes in advising clients across an industry spectrum consisting of banking and financial services, defense, power, aviation, real estate, construction, engineering, manufacturing, media and entertainment, information technology, e-commerce, etc. We also have Mr. Ranjit Mehtani, partner Dhruva Advisor. He is an advocate and chartered accountant and is based in Mumbai. He was listed as an indirect tax leader by the International Tax Review Indirect Tax Leader Guide published in 2018 and 19. He advises on all direct and indirect taxation issues and primarily focuses on all nature of indirect taxes. He has a sector focus that includes but is not limited to the entertainment industry, banking and insurance, logistics, manufacturing, oil and gas, shipping, telecom sector, among others. So that was a brief introduction of the speakers. I would also like to announce that you can write your queries or questions in the question box during the presentation, which will directly reach to the speakers and will be answered by them. Now, without taking any more time, I would like to invite Mr. Neeraj Bagri to start his presentation.
Thank you, everyone. Friends, a very good afternoon. Extraordinary times. We are used to having seminars and conferences have a physical interaction, but looking at the current situation and reality, now the norm is of digital mode and more of webinars. So let's make most of it. So if we can move on to the 3 years of GST, how the journey has been. Normally, it would have called for a mini celebration by the government if there was an increasing trend of tax collection and a time to maybe look back and see what went right, what are the things that needs consideration. So if we can look at the key aspects which we have encountered in last 3 years of GST. So GST came into being, as we all are aware, on 1st July 2017 after several years of trials and tribulations. And finally, it saw the light of the day 3 years back. On introduction of GST, the immediate issues which started coming up was the complex return reporting requirement and the issue of Trans 1 credit transfer to the new regime from the old regime. Then we moved on and we looked at a lot of rationalization of rate happening. A lot of items which attracted a higher rate of 28-29%. If you put excise and VAT put together, were brought down gradually to 18%, leaving very few items in the 28% bracket, which was a very welcome change. And one of the reasons why we wanted to have GST is to remove the inefficiencies and have a lower rate of tax, which will lead to higher compliances. there were a lot of demands for simplification of compliance because GST entailed a lot of compliance requirements. So similar returns for small taxpayers were simplified, the duration improved from 1 month to 3 months, etc., giving them the relief from regular filing. Then we have the Tran 1 issue again continuing in various forms. People were unable to file the Tran 1 because of technical issues, and litigation ensued at various high court, stating that a benefit which is a vested right should not be denied on the basis that Tran 1 or a technical requirement has not been complied with. One of the features of the GST was anti-profiteering mechanism. Now, anti-profiteering by itself is not a new concept which was introduced in India. It has seen its phases in Australia, Malaysia, where GST was introduced earlier. The basic concept was that if there is a benefit which a manufacturer or a trader gets because of introduction of a new law, that benefit ideally ought to have been passed on to the customer and should not be retained by the manufacturer. Now, nobody can doubt the intention behind anti-profiteering, but the way it has been implemented leaves serious question marks. And my colleague will touch upon what are the potential issues which we are now facing in anti-profiteering provisions. GST also necessitated a move from physical to digital, and therefore there was a need to eliminate the check post and introduce e-waybill, electronic waybill concept, which will streamline processes, ensure compliances, and remove the lead time which is required due to physical checks which are being carried in the earlier regime. Then we have seen a spate of industry-specific relief based on the representations made, be it hotel or a real estate or a restaurant. Now there is a question mark again to say that while a lower rate has been prescribed so far as the hospitality industry is concerned, there is a need to maybe relook at it, some of the aspects, whether input tax credit should be allowed with a higher rate. I think those are the points which are there before the government for their consideration. Refund has been a stumbling block, and the experience has been the government is does not part with the refund money as simply or easily it should have been done. While there have been attempts been made to digitize the process and remove hurdles, and various drives have been also been carried out by the government from time to time to remove pendency. But we feel that yes, there is still some improvisation required, make it more of a seamless process, so that the refund is something which is automatically available, available to the industry, and there is no time lag which kind of blocks the working capital. We have seen a spate of use of arrest and provisional attachment provisions in GST. And there has been a shift in the way the government is looking at what was earlier considered as a civil offense to becoming more of an criminal offense. So an economic liability earlier, which was levied with, dealt with an imposition of penalty, now we are seeing increasing trend of arrest being made. And maybe that is the way the times are moving, and something which we need to be cognizant of. Court battles, advanced rulings, while we are still to see the start of ruling because the assessment proceedings have not started, but with the flurry of advanced rulings which have been issued in last 2.5 years, and most of them being negative advanced rulings against the assessee, I think the litigation has started so far as GST is concerned. So this has been the journey so far. In a nutshell, if one looks at what are the key milestones which have been there in last 3 years of GST. Having said that, there has been improvement in collection if one really compares with what was there earlier. Mind you that the dip in collection what we see is because the government is looking at a target of increment of 14% on year-on-year basis, 2015-16 being the base. But if one tries to disassociate with the percentage which the government has put up, I think it has seen a decent growth in tax collection with the introduction of GST. What are the work in progress. If we look at the work in progress, and if we can just see the next slide, the unfinished agenda of GST is the key aspects. The key aspect of GST was that everything should be digitized. There should be lesser of physical intervention, physical filings. The credit should be a seamless process. Whatever taxes the supplier has charged and paid, the recipient should automatically be entitled to it without much of scrutiny. For that, the IT platform, the reporting, the return filing requirements is still something which is a work in progress. So while new returns, along with the complete functionality of credit matching system, which were supposed to be in place by April 2020, had already been pushed, and now looking at the current situation, we may see a further deadline being pushed to ensure that the companies are able to overall and gear up their systems before the new regime, or I would say the new system takes over. So return filing, launch of e-invoicing, again that is one of the measures which the government is looking to curb the menace of fake invoicing or fraudulent transactions, to say that all the invoices will be generated by a common system, and the details that are required to be filled in at various levels will automatically be captured once the e-invoice is generated. Again, the idea being that the level of compliances that a company is required to undertake should gradually reduce. Setting up of the appellate tribunal. So there has been a ruling of the Madras High Court where this process is so far stalled, and we look forward to where the government will need to make those changes which the courts are looking into, and we have an appellate tribunal in place. Till such time, all the appeals that are supposed to be filed at the appellate tribunal level have been put on hold, and they will not suffer from the limitation of not filing an appeal before the appellate forum. One of the other important aspect unfinished agenda is inclusion of non-GST sectors. The chief of them is petroleum and a stamp duty in real estate. Now, with this current situation, we really cannot say when we will see an inclusion of petroleum products, but that will remain as one of the unfinished agenda so far as GST is concerned. I think rate rationalization, reduction, consolidation is something which the government is looking at and should look at. So the whole entire idea of introduction of GST was to make it a simple tax, have lesser of rate structures, lesser exemptions, so that there is lesser leakage, more compliance. So initially when GST got introduced, we had basically those four structures apart from zero rate, 5, 12, 18 and 28. And the need of the hour would be to see whether these rate structures can be collapsed, and perhaps a 12 and 18, whether that can be merged into one rate. So the lesser the number of rates, the lesser chances of any litigation with the authorities, and that will help in simplifying the tax laws. So these are the things which are key items which we should be looking forward for completion in the next foreseeable future. With this, we move on to examine what are the key advanced ruling key issues which we are facing in GST, and I will hand it over to my colleague Ritesh and Ranjit to take you through that.
Thank you, Neeraj. I think that was a very nice run through on the journey of GST. Neeraj did mention about how from start to end the entire tax has moved. Let me just add on to that to say that with respect to each of those legs, while the law was always a welcome law, it replaced multiple taxes. However, with respect to all of what Neeraj has mentioned, there have been a lot of implementation issues. And while we are covering the broad level issues out here, not because the time available is not much so as to cover the entirety of the issues. Uh, the issue, the challenge is that none of the issues are getting resolved anytime sooner, and therefore it leaves the taxpayer in a position as to what are the next steps that they need to take to ensure that there is no loss of either a credit or there is no unnecessary payment of tax, which ultimately becomes a cost. Let me first start with the transition issues. This was the very foundation of GST. To say that when I'm moving from my excise law to my GST law, obviously I had credits under the excise regime, the VAT regime, and the service charge regime. We ought to carry forward. We have looked at judgments in the past regime to say that credit is a fundamental right. It is a substantive right, and once it is approved, the right cannot be denied merely because of procedural lapse. We have all lived through those decisions in the past, which has been again and again been reiterated. And the question which came up was that when I moved to transition provision, section 140, which was again a very detailed provision for transition of credit, it introduced a lot of conditionalities in terms of how the credit should be allowed. So one of the critical conditionalities, of course, was the timelines. Another was the type of taxes which can be carried forward. And the challenge which came up was can this are these conditionalities which were introduced by the GST law were valid when if you go to the pre-GST regime, all those conditions were non-existent. So on this slide you can see an issue with respect to 140 subsection 3, which was dealers credit, where the law said that the dealers can take credit of goods which was purchased within a period of 12 months. Now, the question which came up was that if you go to the pre-GST regime, there is no such conditionality. The only thing was that I had to have a first aid dealer registration and I had to have an excise invoice in place. And then there was obviously there was some timelines in terms of 1 year, etc. But that was the timelines which were prescribed within the law. Now, why do I have to follow the condition of 12 months, which was laid down by GST, if such conditions were non-existent in the pre-GST regime became a keen bone of contention in JCB Limited, which was the first decision of the Bombay High Court, where the Bombay High Court mentioned that the law can, in its right, impose conditions. So if credit is not a vested right, accrued right, it is a concession. And when I'm granting you the credit, I can impose conditions. Impose conditions pursuant to which the credit can be taken. This was a negative decision in JCB. However, subsequently, the Gujarat High Court and Filcotrade said, no, sorry, if you are imposing conditions which has a retrospective impact, you are basically disallowing credit which should have been allowed to the SSE otherwise, then such a right cannot be taken away and therefore the credit is available. After that, there was a series of judgments which were for or against. So I've listed down all of those decisions. So we have Willowwood Chemicals, Gujarat High Court, which was negative. We had Siddharth Enterprises, which did not, actually, while it was a Gujarat High Court decision, it failed to follow, it did not refer to Willowwood. It relied upon Philco. Interesting to note that, again, a rectification application was filed for Siddharth Enterprises to declare it as per incurrum, which the Supreme Court said no, it cannot be, the High Court said it cannot be declared as per incurrum because it has relied upon Philco. We then had Nelco Limited, which was again Bombay High Court, where the issue was, so it was not on 140 subsection 3, but it was on challenging the ultra virus of Rule 117. Now, Rule 117 prescribed for a 90-day time period for the purposes of filing of transfer. And what Nelco, what was challenged in Nelco was to say that such timelines cannot be prescribed under the law. Again, the decision was negative in Nelco, and it distinguished the various other judgment to say that all the judgments were primarily on vested rights, where the substantive the 107 ultra virus was not challenged. We now have the latest decision in brand equity, where the challenge was with respect to again filing of trans 1 and whether I can file that returns now and take credit. So what the court held in brand equities were primarily three things, and which becomes the core of brand equity, is that credit is a vested right, it is an accrued right, and once that vested right or accrued right has come to the SSE, the same cannot be denied. The other thing, important thing which brand equity held was that Rule 117 is only directory, so which prescribes the 90-day time limit. It is not mandatory, but it is directory. One of the bases of the brand equity judgment was discrimination. So you cannot discriminate between a taxpayer who has faced technical glitches and a taxpayer who has not faced technical glitches, and with respect to which a challenge was made under Article 14 of the Constitution. The only issue in the context of brand equity judgment was what the court said was, look, while we agree that 117 is prescriptory, it is not mandatory, it is only a directory provision. However, you cannot get unfettered time limit to take credit. So what they said was, we will go by the Limitation Act, and we therefore say that there is a 3-year time limit to take credit. Now, you must always be aware that the 3-year time limit has already ended on 30th June. And while the directions were issued to the government to open the GST portal for filing of Tran 1, none of the portal has not got opened. Now, we had seen subsequent petitions being filed before the High Court, basis brand equity, to say that please direct for opening of the portal. Some of the decisions actually have said that, look, if the portal is not open, why don't you just go ahead and you have the right to take the credit at the 3B. Now, what we have also very recently seen is that there was an internal circular which was issued by the government on all of these petitions, where the government has actually instructed the various jurisdictions to take various arguments as to why the credit is not a vested or accrued right and why credit is not available. This obviously clearly means that the government is not going to open Trans 1 despite there being directions. In the meanwhile, what has also happened is there are two things which have happened after this. So brand equity got challenged before the Supreme Court, and Supreme Court has given a stay on the brand equity gesture. The other thing which has happened is that the retrospective amendment was made under the law, where as you are aware, there was timelines which were, so the main Act 140 was amended to say that the government has the powers to prescribe timelines. So, the key question which comes up, in the midst of all of these challenges, what should a taxpayer do? Should the taxpayer take the credit, not take the credit? Let me cover a couple of more issues on Tran 1, and then we can speak about a key aspect of availment versus utilization, which becomes important in the context of a taxpayer taking a view in terms of what he should do, whether he should take the credit, if he takes the credit, whether he should avail it, or he should just keep it on, or whether he should utilize it, or he should just keep it on hold, or he should just take the credit and use. We will come to that aspect very shortly. So another issue which sort of came up in the transition provisions were the ISD credit. So you must be aware that ISD is a mechanism for distribution of credits, and none of the provisions which specifically provided in terms of the manner in which the ISD credit have to be transitioned. Now there is 140 subsection 7 which speaks about transfer of ISD credit even where invoices are received after implementation of GST. That is the only provision which speaks about ISD. And what has happened is that while there was no specific provision and companies have probably now taken credit in GST 3B. So one approach was obviously you take the credit, you distribute the entire credit before GST got implemented. Many taxpayers have not been able to do that. So they have taken the credit in 3B, and what happened subsequently was demand notices were issued to the taxpayer to say that you cannot carry forward the ISD credit. So those petitions, I have listed down the names where these are pending, where interim orders have been issued. The issue is still pending with the court. The another aspect is, the revision of ST3 returns, where the law said that if you have taken credit in your ST3 returns and if you revise the returns upwards, then whatever is the upward revision, you will have to apply for a refund. Now, there were taxpayers who had actually followed this approach where there was an upward revision and they had applied for a refund. Even such refunds have got rejected and notices have been issued. And again, not relying upon the transition provisions to say that, and the arguments which are being taken is that under the pre-GST regime, there is no provision for refund. So how can you grant you the refund for a credit which pertains to a pre-GST regime? Again, a very, very funny argument, because my transition provisions clearly provide for a refund scenario. Most of you would have this issue of, secondary higher education cess and KKC being carried forward. And the question which comes up is that whether they are eligible duties in terms of the provisions. We all are aware that there was a constitutional challenge to this. So notices were issued by the department to reverse the credit in. So the decision in Sutherland Global Services Private Limited, which gave a positive decision to say that no, your eligible duties would include all these cesses and therefore the credit is available. However, again, two situations which happened. The government has gone ahead and amended the law retrospectively. That is situation number one. The other thing which has happened is in terms of so eligible duties was per se amended, and then there was a retrospective amendment with respect to the timeline. The decision of the Sutherland, which was the single member bench decision, was challenged before the division bench, and division bench has now ordered a stay on the operation of Sutherland single member bench High Court decision. So as I mentioned, with respect to all these petitions being filed on, credit accrual, vested rights, my right to take credit for the past, etc. And there are certain other points which I'm going to discuss in the subsequent slide as regards the 2-2A credit, the 10% issue, utilization credit issue. The key factor is what do taxpayer need to do when there is no clarity in terms of what I need to do with those. So there are two aspects. One is that credit, can it be availed? That is issue number one. The second is, if I avail the credit, can I utilize the credit? And obviously then the question is, are there any interest implications? Obviously the third aspect is that I avail the credit and I reverse the credit rather than utilizing it. Now, it would be important to understand the law around these aspects, because that would probably determine in terms of the steps that somebody can take today on how do I secure my rights while this petition may be pending before the High Courts, but I need to secure my rights today because there are timelines, there are limitations, etc., and I cannot lose on those timelines and limitations. So, if I trace back the history of applicability of interest, we had similar provision under the service tax law, which spoke about availment or utilization, and then there was an amendment to say availed and utilized. And we had the decision of Indo-Gulf. So I think yeah. So where what the Supreme Court actually held was that if the credit has been availed, and this decision was in the facts of Supreme Court, in the facts of where credit was actually availed and utilized. And what it held was that once the law has particularly said that credit availed and utilized, you cannot read and as or. The law, unless and until you have other provisions which indicate otherwise, but you will have to read and as, and the credit has been utilized, so interest will have to be paid. Thereafter, there was the decision of High Court in the case of Bilforge, where the High Court said, look, the decision, and in Bilforge, what had happened was that the taxpayer had taken the credit and then subsequently reversed the credit. And what the High Court said was, look, while the Supreme Court decision was in the context of credit availed and which was utilized, but if you avail the credit, you utilize it and you subsequently reverse it, then as per the settled provision in law, it amounts to non-availment, and consequently there is no need for any interest. The question which then comes up is what happens to all of this under the GST regime. Now under GST, let me first go to section 50, where what section 50 says is that interest is applicable where you fail to pay any tax. So the first question which arises is that when I avail the credit and I do not utilize it, have I failed to pay any tax? So first of all, the primary applicability of section 50 per se in terms of levy of interest. The second is the decision of there is a decision of Oriental Commerce, which again is a High Court decision in the GST regime, which has also relied upon the Supreme Court decision in the pre-GST regime, and has held that the decision was in the pre-GST regime was credit availed and utilized. And if the credit has not been availed and not been utilized, sorry, if the credit has been availed and not been utilized, then the decision ought not to apply. It is also important to note at this stage is the scheme of the GST law. Now, the scheme of the GST law, how it functions is to say that we have an electronic credit ledger. So when you take the credit, first of all, you take the credit on the basis of self-assessment, and the credit is provisionally allowed to you. That is section 41 of the CGST law, which says that it has to be provisionally allowed to you on the basis of self-assessment. Now, the credit does not get utilized, does not become your credit till you actually utilize the credit. So even the scheme in the manner in which the GST law operates, it is just a credit lying in my credit ledger. In fact, there are instructions which have been issued which authorizes the taxpayer to block the credit, which clearly means that they can at any point in time. So it doesn't mean that once I've taken the credit, it is unconditionally available to me. The authorities can block the credit at any point. So if I have to go through all of the legal precedents which have come on this issue, clearly one of the strong arguments is that I can take the credit, I can avail, when I say take means avail the credit, and I may decide not to utilize it, keep it pending. That is option one. And I can strongly argue that no interest should be applicable. The second is I take the credit and I reverse the credit. So, these are clearly two of the options which are available to the taxpayer in terms of securing that, whatever, credits may be disputed, they do not get lost just simply because the decisions are pending before the courts. So moving on to the next point is, return filing and ITC availment. Now, again, here we are all aware of, section the 39 returns. So what my 16.4 says is that the credit would not be available unless, the credit has been taken before the returns filed under 39.1. And the way the 39 provisions have operated is where, and earlier the taxpayer was supposed to file a GSTR 1, GSTR 2 and a GSTR 3, but GSTR 3 never became operational. And the only returns which were prescribed were GSTR 3 in under 39.1. There was a subsequent amendment whereby Rule 61.5 was introduced, where 3B was prescribed as a return. Now, all of this got challenged before the Gujarat High Court in terms of the timelines for taking credit. So the law says either returns under 39.1 or the annual return, whichever is earlier. The decision in Gujarat High Court held that, as per 16.4, the returns prescribed as per 39 are GSTR 3, not 3B, and therefore the time limit for taking credit is annual return. Now, you all must be aware that the annual returns have got delayed. So 17-18, I think, was December 2019. 18-19 again has got delayed till, I think the last date now is 30th September 2020. So the question which then arises is that, can I take the credit up to the date of my filing of annual return even for 1920? Now, there was then a retrospective amendment in October 2019, which amended 39.1 and prescribed GSTR 3B as the returns. Now, clearly the question which arises is twofold. So one is what happens to, first of all, whether the retrospective amendment is valid. The second is if I have credits prior to October 2019. So, for example, 18, and we are talking about 18-19 credits, 19-20 credits. I have credits prior to October 2019, one is which I would have already taken in the returns. So in the September returns, I have taken credits for the past period. Then there are credits which I have not taken, and then can I take the credit in the annual return which I'm going to file now? Now we are all here talking about the 18-19 credits. Now, with respect to credits which I would have taken prior to October 2019, there is a clearly strong argument to say that once my credit has accrued to me. Now, when I say accrued vested right, which means that prior to the amendment, GSTR 3B was not a return prescribed under Section 39, so I had a legal and a valid right to take the credit. So I had taken the credit and the right has accrued to me, and then there was a retrospective amendment, and a retrospective amendment cannot take a credit which was rightly taken by me, cannot take away the substantive rights. Right is a substantive right and it cannot take away those vested rights. However, what happens to after October 2019 is a question mark. So my annual returns are yet to be filed, and the question which comes up is, still can I argue that October 2019 amendment would not apply to the period of 18-19? And in fact, if I stretch the argument to the period up to October 2019. So this is again going to be a bone of contention. Needless to say, you are going to see a situation where a department is going to issue show cause notices and taxpayer will have to litigate on this issue. And again, the question then which comes up is that, do I take the credit? Do I simply avail it, or should I even utilize the credit? Moving on to the next issue is, refund of accumulated credits. So here I have primarily covered two aspects. So one is the inverted duty structure refund and what are the anomalies in that particular provision. And second is an opportunity where, the question is, can I have some opportunity in terms of the recent judgment in RBI? And the third is the issue which has come up because of a recent amendment in the definition of how you calculate the refund under 89. So coming up quickly to the first issue is inverted duty structure issue. So if you see the law, inverted duty refund is allowed only for imports. They are not allowed for import services and capital. And in the interim, the provisions read differently. They were amended retrospectively. In fact, a circular was also issued to say that it was also always meant to be for import. Now, the point is that why only inputs? Why not input service and capital book. There have been petitions filed on this aspect to say that what is allowed to be under the law is input tax credit. Now, input tax credit covers both input services and capital. What is the criteria for distinguishing between a taxpayer who is taking inputs and a taxpayer which is taking input and input services both? There is no intelligible differential or a criteria for denying the credit on input services, whereas allowing the, when I say credit, means refund of input and not allowing me the credit on input services. So there have been again petitions filed on this issue. So there is a transtonal there is a transtonal AFCON's JV judgment where, and there are a couple of Rajasthan High Court judgments where an interim order has been passed directing the department to accept the refund application. So while there is no finality on the issue, but there have been petitions also filed on this aspect. The second issue is, delay in taking credit under the GST returns. So as you are aware that there are no provisions under the GST law which allows for amendment of returns. And this aspect was actually considered in Bharti Airtel, where because of the matching, so the 2A never got activated and the credit was taken in a delayed manner subsequently. But when the credit was taken subsequently, it was taken up in the returns of a subsequent period because I could not have amended the returns and taken the credit in my past returns. So the issue which came up for consider, and obviously when I was not able to take the credit, I was forced to pay GST in cash. And the issue which came up then for consideration is that was the taxpayer responsible for this? Because if you should have ought to have allowed me the right to amend the return, and obviously many provisions were cited in terms of saying that that right to amend the return was inherently available in the law. However, that was never activated by the GST. So here, what has happened is what culminates is that once you allow the taxpayer to revise the return, in which has happened in the case of Bharti Airtel, and there was no direction in terms of how that right has to be exercised. But however, if you amend the return, what happens is your tax which you have already paid in cash becomes an excess tax paid. Once it becomes an excess tax paid, you can go ahead and claim a refund. So there are provisions where tax paid in cash could be withdrawn. You will file an application with the department and you need to take a refund of tax paid in cash. Now, similar opportunity also then arises in the case of Trans1. So you know that the entire Trans1 filing was in a mess initially. There were technical glitches. They were delayed in filing of return. There were extension of timelines because of which many taxpayers were not able to file Trans1, which obviously means that I would have had to go and pay GST in cash. Can I apply the same ratio, go to the High Court, file a petition to say that, look, I was forced to pay GST in cash for no fault of mine. You allow me to now amend the returns, take the credit in that particular period. Obviously, as a consequence, the GST becomes, the GST which I paid in cash comes to my cash ledger, I can take a refund of that. Another issue with respect to accumulated credit is, the amendment in the definition of the formula of export. This says that the value, I can claim my export turnover is only 1.5 times the value of goods domestically supplied by the same or similarly placed supplier. Now, what is the logic of this amendment is very, very unclear. Now, I could have a situation where domestically I only supply 10% goods, whereas my 90% is exports. The other issue is what it says is same or similarly placed supplier. Now, the question is, logically it should have been my own domestic turnover, but a reading indicates that it is also other suppliers who are similarly placed, who are selling the same or similar goods in the market. And then it says ad declared by the supplier, whichever it is. Now, how I as a taxpayer would be able to identify what are the goods which are being domestically sold by other suppliers for similarly placed goods? So again, in our view, this provision is devoid of any merit and can be challenged as unconstitutional. It doesn't really. So when my law is very clear, substantive law is very clear that when I export goods or services, I can claim a refund. The procedure law cannot put conditions which actually deny me the benefit of the refund. So moving on to the next slide. So I have here listed down some of the key ITC issues, and I will quickly take you through this, considering I may not have enough time. So first issue, obviously, which everyone is aware of, is the 2-2A mismatch and the 10% restriction which has been placed. Now, if you see how the law has functioned until now, we had section 43 in the law, which tried for filing of the GSTR2 returns, again, which never got activated, which never came into operation. GSTR2 was never filed. We then had section 43B, which never got notified. Both the provisions in a way said that, look, if a taxpayer, if a vendor does not file the returns, you cannot take the credit. And if you have taken the credit, both the provisions actually provided for taking of credit up to a particular limit, and then subsequently add it to your output liability and pay the tax. Now, because 42 never got implemented, because 43B never got notified, the question is, am I supposed to reverse the credit which is not matching today? Legally speaking, the answer is clearly no. There is no provision in the law today, as we speak, which talks about reversal of credit on account of 2-2A mismatch. In fact, there have been circular clarifications which were issued to say that this is the 2-2A mismatch is only for your guidance. Where you have to just go and see whether the credits have come in 2A or not, but it is not meant for, you don't have to really do the reversal at that stage. Now, again, here the issue which I have discussed at length is what should taxpayer do, whether they should avail, they should reverse. And important point is that so what is likely to happen in demand notices from the department, and I can tell you that all the demand notices are amenable to challenge. So once assessment starts and you are receiving notices where department is saying prove to me 2-2A mismatch, there is no such provision which requires me to do any kind of a reversal. So do I, and clearly the point is that we need to contest such notices, and we will see a number of writ petitions which would get filed on this aspect. In fact, writ petitions have been filed on this. A related issue to the 2-2A mismatch is, payment of tax by the supplier. So one of the conditions under section 16 is that the supplier should pay tax to the government. And the question then which comes up is that if the supplier doesn't pay tax, so there could be a situation where the taxpayer, the vendor has filed the returns, it has come in your 2A, but subsequently he has not paid tax for any reason. Then can I be liable for the purposes of that tax? Now, in the context of the pre-GST regime under VAT, there have been decisions which, sorry, yeah. So I thought my connection was lost. So there were decisions in the pre-GST regime. So one is the Mahalakshmi decision, where the point of contention was, when the vendor had not paid tax, can I take the credit? The decision is negative. However, thereafter we have a Delhi High Court judgment which has clearly said that irrespective of whether the supplier has paid the tax or not, the credit cannot be disallowed. I think as far as I understand the decision, so that is Arise India Limited, and the decision has been upheld by the Supreme Court. So this was in the context where some of the states in the VAT regime did not have specific provisions which asked for a reversal of credit if the supplier has not paid tax. And the question which clearly now comes up is what would happen under GST, and will the ratio of this decision still apply under GST? In fact, we have seen a situation where garnishee notices. So one is a department saying you cannot take credit. Second is for the very same vendor who has not paid the tax, I am receiving garnishee notices to say that whatever balance I read you have for the vendor, now you go ahead and pay it. There is one slide which Ranjit will be covering on this aspect in terms of such kind of notices being there. Coming to a couple of substantive issues, which is the 17(5)(c) and D, is in the context of immovable. Now, as you all are aware that there is again a dispute in terms of what constitutes immovable. So, there is a definition of work contract, and it is, so the definition of immovable is relevant from two perspectives. One is the credit, and another is whether a contract is a works contract or not. Immovable is not defined. The Supreme Court in Commission of Central Excise and Solid Engineering Works have said that anything which is attached to the earth can be considered as immovable, but something which can be removed without substantial damage is not immovable. And the question which then comes up is to say that when I want to take credit, and we saw the entire dispute on solar power plants in terms of whether it is movable or not immovable. Something which is movable, but the department treats it as immovable, becomes a point of contention in terms of taking the credit. And again, there is a condition to say that it should be capitalized in the books of account. So a huge point of debate and a dispute, because there is a debate and a dispute on what is movable or what is immovable. We also are aware of the Safari Retreats Private Limited judgment, where under 17(5)(d), where the Supreme Court had interpreted of the term own use, and the question is that when a mall owner, when a mall owner has leased, given the mall on rent, and he's using credits for the is spending GST on purchase of cement, steel, etc., and all other equipments, can he take credit because uh, of 17(5)(d) specifically restricts such credit? It is interesting that in Safari Retreats, the High Court has held that yes, such credit has to be allowed because ultimately GST has been paid on the output, and 17(5)(d) has to be read down to that extent so as to allow credit. Now again, Safari Retreat is an SLP has been filed before the Supreme Court, which is pending. There is only one Delhi High Court judgment, which is a jurisdictional High Court judgment. So there are issues and contentions which are being raised in terms of if I have incurred expenditure on construction, etc., and I'm into operate leasing of malls, etc., should I take the credit? Should I not take the credit? So I did mention to you about the issue of interest. And just to quickly go through the provision of interest. So if I see, it says fails to pay tax or any part thereof, and then there is section 73, which says that where it appears that that any tax has not been paid, short paid, erroneously refunded, or where input tax rate has been wrongly availed or utilized. So when you talk about demand notice under 73, it specifically talks about input tax credit, which is not there under section 50. Yes, clearly one of the arguments is when I say fails to pay tax, it also includes wrong taken credit, not which was not eligible, which I have taken, and because of which I have not paid the output tax. So that is yes, one of the interpretations. However, the question is that when I have taken credit rightly and I have reversed the credit, in terms of the provisions of the law. So let's take an example of 180 days. When I take the credit, I have to reverse the credit if I do not pay to the vendor in 180 days. So within that 180 days, I have taken the credit rightly. So can an interest apply? Similar issue is arising when you do a true up of credit at the end of the financial year. What the law says is you can reverse the credit at any time before September. But the interest provision says you will have to pay interest from April. Now, why do I need to pay from April? Because from April to September, I have rightly taken the credit. The law has told me to reverse, but it has also given me a timeline up to September. Then can I argue that for the true up, for the period between April and September, if assuming for a moment I have reversed the credit in September, do I need to reverse the credit? So similar such contentions with respect to interest also arises in the context of 2(2)(a), which we have already discussed. I have already mentioned to you that 42 never came into operation. So there was absolutely no requirement of any reversal. So the question of interest also per se doesn't arise. Yeah, a specific slide on ITC. A lot of questions coming up on whether I can take credit or not. Now, if you see the definition of input service, it says in the course or furtherance of business. And I think the key point that we probably need to ask is, can I now do business without all of these items? So, in certain cases, there is a provision which says that if the law mandates you that you need to provide this to the employee, if mandatory by the law for the time being enforced, that's what the provision is. Then in such situation, when I am providing this to the employees, can I take the credit or not? It is again a huge issue which is coming up. In our view, it can take the credit, though obviously department is going to dispute on the point that this is nothing but personal consumption. However, the argument is, how can it be personal consumption when without this now I cannot do my business? And similar contention arises in the context of CSR. So while there are lot many issues which would probably have taken a huge amount of time the entire day when you come to ITC issue, I have just listed down some of the key other issues which are pending conclusion. So we talk about securities and whether they're exempt or not. Clearly, securities is excluded from the definition of goods, and if they're excluded from the definition of goods, then I have a formula to say that I have to reverse credit on trading in securities. A point which is not decided, and again, I'm sure will form subject matter of litigation. Capital goods credit, the provision says that you have to, reverse capital goods credit. You have to consider 60 months of time period. You take full credit today, but as and when you provide exempt services, exempt supplies, you have to reverse the credit on a proportionate basis. Again, the question is, will interest be applicable? As I said, the law is actually allowing me to take the credit and use the credit. When the law is doing that, can I say that the credit is not rightly taken? Can I say that there was a failure to tax because I have not rightly taken the credit? The answer would probably be no. Same issue is arising in the context of true up, which I have discussed just some time back. One interesting issue on true up is that whether I need to do a true up monthly or annually, because the law says for the tax period, and tax period means monthly. So if I have if I have to true up at the end of the financial year, can I do it actually month-wise? A separate vertical, separate place of business. So earlier there was this provision which allowed you separate registration for a separate vertical. Now the provision has been amended to separate place of business. What happens to situations where I have taken registration in the same place of business where earlier the registration was taken as separate vertical? There is absolutely no clarity when the provision got amended. In our view, the old registration should not get impacted, and you can still take credit for the separate vertical. ITC on goods written off, the view again is, it's fully written off and not partial written off. And again, written off doesn't mean write down. So if you write down the value of the goods in the books, that doesn't mean written off. That is still only a write down, and you have to reverse credit only as written off. Another contention issue, which is gift, so whether it can be considered as promotion or marketing, again being litigated quite extensively. ITC on guest house, garden, residential colony. Now the definition of ITC has been expanded substantially to say that use in the course of furtherance of business. There is in fact an advance ruling which says that on garden credit is available, but they have distilled out credit on guest house. But if my guest house is, not only for employees, but also for, let's say, consultants, also for, clients, etc. When they come in, I would want them to stay in my guest house. Even residential colony, other than food and beverages. So residential colony could be one disputed point, but repair and maintenance of residential. I'm in a remote location, my factory is in a remote location. I do not have any facility, I have to provide residence. It is in the course of furtherance of business. And we just discussed about CSR, whether available, not available, and again, a point of dispute, which will sort of go on under GST. With this, I would invite Ranjit to sort of cover some of the other key taxability issues under GST. We will take up the questions at the end of the session. Ranjit, on to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Ritesh. So firstly, just a very warm welcome to everyone who joined us today. While we celebrated the anniversary for GST, the third anniversary yesterday, there are several issues that we can talk about. Ritesh and Neeraj just, I would say, touched upon and maybe just scratched the surface. And I will add to that list of things which one must discuss when one discusses GST. And I've got 6 specific sort of topics to pick up and talk about. But I think suffice to say that it's insufficient time, even if you were to take it for the whole day and discuss it, because each of these in itself can constitute, sessions by themselves. And therefore, what we would do is just broadly touch upon the key points of each of these topics, and hope that it can tickle you in some way, and at least make some sort of sense somewhere. So let's take on the first one, which is the interco or inter-branch related services, or what we popularly call as cross-charge services. The one thing I know about this particular topic is that if you ask 4 people, they will give you 5 opinions. And the one issue on which the division of views is stark and is as clear as daylight is this particular one. As we at Dhruva also look at issues for our clientele, we notice that several people are still grappling with the set of issues and questions on whether or not to do a charge, whether it is legitimate, is the right approach to have a distribution done under the ISD scheme. If yes, then it's cumbersome. How do I deal with that? And we've noticed that there are several different types of taxpayers around here, where we see someone who has not made any arrangement for a cross charge or a distribution, and perhaps has left it for the fateful day when the department comes knocking. There are certain others who have gone quite conservatively, and maybe because the ability to take credit exists, they have made a cross charge for everything, including salary and HR costs. Now, as we would understand, GST in India is supposed to be on supply, And within the concept of supply, we do have the situation where there's an exclusion in terms of Schedule 3 in the HR or the cost for salary. So you cannot have a GST on that. While that may be the position as it emerges out of the GST law, a variety of people do take the view on the basis that there is an inherent service which is there. And so even if there is a inter-branch related salary component, we would make a cross charge on that. And finally, then there are certain others who are perhaps in a mixed bag and make a allocation or make a cross charge for a portion, not for the whole thing. They would typically avoid it on salary component or HR costs. They would typically not have the brand usage, the inter-co or the inter-branch brand usage allocated and have a value attributed to that. So there are whole sets of different sort of approaches which are being taken. And what we do know that is that several taxpayers in the initial phase, and that is therefore meaning 17-18, the fiscal of 17-18, have not taken any steps or concrete steps in respect of that particular year, whereas they may have taken a certain stand or a position as for the remainder of the years. So what that does is it brings into question the sort of consistency in practice and approach, where a departmental authority then has a very easy ability to say that, okay, if I do notice from your records that for 17 and 18 you've not made a cross charge or a distribution, but you've done it for the other balance of the years, then isn't there a difficulty in terms of 17-18, and shouldn't I have to sort of proceed against you, issue a show cause, and do all of those things? So these are the points which are typically coming up in cross charge and in the ISD situation. Let's also notice one thing and appreciate one other aspect of this, is that if there is a service between two branches and or between two company units of the same group, then there should not be a misgiving that tax would not be applicable. We know and are aware of the entire debate that is surrounding the Columbia Asia advanced ruling, the appellate ruling also, and now which sits in the High Court for the Karnataka High Court's views. But the bottom line is that if the head office or a unit of the entire company, the legal entity, is providing services, and it could be some sort of a common services, or it could be some sort of an IT related aspect, or HR related costs, expenses, then in that situation, you would be able to say that there is a rendition of service, and so you must have a levy of the GST. And that's exactly what has been said in the Columbia Asia decision in the advanced ruling. Now, the question is that, is it your facts or is it not? What is the arrangement that you are particularly in? How many group companies are there? What is the sort of interaction between each of them? What are the branches? How do they value their goods and services if there is a movement between them, and so on and so forth? And within that, then you would have the issue of vexed points in terms of taxability for brand, for trademark, for corporate guarantee. Now, one would argue that corporate guarantee is in the nature of a shareholder service for himself, and the transfer pricing jurisprudence sort of tends to sort of support that. So would that then become a basis to say that even if I am extending a corporate guarantee, there cannot be said to be a service, and therefore no cross charge should arise for that? So these are again questions which, while we've had 3 years of GST, these are open, and only time will sort of give us the final conclusion on these positions. The point, of course, is that as taxpayers, conscious attempt must be made and steps must be taken to get the position correct in your own facts and in your own situation, so that there is no subsequent litigation that you may have to face. The connected points I would also just talk about and touch upon in this case is that as one goes about either making a distribution, which is then as per the scheme given in the law, or instead, if you were to go and opt into making a cross charge, which once you've crossed the hurdle of whether you should or should not, the issue that will come up typically is whether the valuation issue is to be sorted out in a simple way by saying that credit is available on the other side, and so I will take up a declared price, and that should suffice, as is the concept of open market value. But where credit is available, the deemed price is acceptable. Now, we have at least one advanced ruling, which you would notice at the bottom of the screen in Specs Makers Opticians in Tamil Nadu, which has in fact gone on to make a little obscure sort of observation on this point. And they are not quite thrilled by the sort of submission which was made, that if there was credit availability on the other side, literally any value could be declared and it could be accepted. That was not how they concluded it, and instead left it to say that 90% is the sort of basis on which you should operate, and if not, then you have to go and find the open market value. So this is the entire set of points which one will have to go through when one deals with the cross charge and the ISD debate. The next sort of subject topic I would talk about is intermediary. Again, I can say for ourselves here that intermediary is perhaps one of that area which sees the maximum amount of advanced ruling related outcome, and also sees a lot of advisory sort of need and support at the taxpayer's end when dealing with an issue of intermediary. Now, what's the deal with intermediary is like this. We borrowed from our service tax law the concept of intermediary. Now, as we borrowed that concept, we also borrowed pretty much the definition. However, we have made a sort of little tinkering in that definition, and where previously the definition said very clearly that you should not provide the main service on his own account. Today, in the GST regime, we are saying that he should the exclusion is for the person who provides such service on his own account or such goods on his own account. Now, when you say such goods and such supply of such services on his own account, what would the sort of purport be, when in fact the first part of it is meant to deal with that person who's providing a sort of intermediate, or what I would call a conduit services. So the definition for one is not the most happily worded in my opinion. The other aspect of the point on intermediary is that there is now a very blurred line as to what is and what should be an intermediary. The entire approach that most advanced rulings tend to take, and several of them are from Maharashtra or from West Bengal, and we will notice that they completely obfuscate the position on what is services to and what is services as a facilitator, or what we would say as an arranging party. So if I am a conduit or not is the big question, which is not appreciated. Whereas in almost all the sort of advanced rulings that we would read, with the exception of one odd one, that the conclusion inevitably would be that this is in the nature of intermediary, almost so as to say that everything in the world can then become an intermediary service, and then obviously go on to sort of tax that transaction. Now, this of course causes a great deal of difficulties to the parties who are in the export of services stream, because for them then the tax gets loaded onto the transaction, and what does happen is, contrary to what we would generally say of export your goods and services, don't export your taxes. In this situation, we are actually exporting our taxes. And in the flip side, when we look at the importation of such intermediary services, we will land up not paying any GST, because the place of supply for such activity is overseas. So we have here a situation where with this one issue, we've got a very tilted sort of approach to taxation. And I would say that this is one area where we've also seen several developments. We have the circular, the clarification and circular in July of 2019, almost to the year back, and which in a few months in December of 2019 was effectively withdrawn. Now, while it was being withdrawn, the 37th Council minutes records that there was actually a proposed altered circular and clarification which was to be issued. Now, they do not land up issuing that circular. They instead just withdraw or resign the earlier circular. So what it does tell me as a reader of these sort of developments is that the concept of intermediary was not clear from the word go. The government, the lawmaker, and including the GST Council are learning on the game as they go along. and depending on what is the pain points and what are the sort of issues being faced, they are sort of reacting. And it is this sort of an approach and policy which one would expect would not be the case with GST, and one hopes that sort of can be resolved. Also, just as a matter of how the sort of position has played itself out, is at the 37th GST Council meeting, we had a sort of exemption being given to an intermediary who renders services in the context of a merchanting trade. So up along until the September of 2019 or thereabouts, when that notification came, we have a situation where a intermediary for a merchanting trade could typically pay or be required to pay the GST, and the post facto notification for exemption would in fact strengthen the view that a departmental officer could take, is that prior to the date of this notification, I would be able to levy tax on it. Now, with the merchanting trade related sort of advanced ruling, which we've had almost about 2 weeks ago, we have a situation where even the transaction itself was sought to be taxed. And on top of that, we have an intermediary who was also possibly expected to pay tax at that point in time. So this issue really needs people to sort of go back, examine how they contract, what is the sort of terms and conditions. As you can see on the screen, some of these activities you would render in your own right, and very much rendered to, and not in a manner of speaking would be a conduit or a facilitation arrangement. And in that situation, it would possibly be the right way to sort of ensure you hive them off, value them separately, and then go on for the purposes of your transaction, lest you remain with a lot of litigation, which we are already seeing. Videsh, thanks. Yeah. So one more topic and issue which we have quite significantly borrowed from our service tax law, the composite supply and mixed supply concept. Now, what we've seen is that we've got 3 years of GST gone by, and we have a whole set of views which keep coming along. So when you look at the situation in the advanced ruling concerning supply of UPS and batteries, it was held to be a mixed supply, as the battery is not specific to the UPS along with which it is supplied. But the point which perhaps has not been appreciated is that that point of that supply for that particular transaction, would it not qualify and be a case of a composite supply? Now, we would need to see what was argued and how it was presented, but then again, the one size fits all cannot be the approach. And as we know that these advanced rulings are not binding, but they do go out and sort of create a lot of turbulence in the field formation, and then we have views like this which will go around and be slapped upon taxpayers. And so clarity on this issue would really be look forward to. And as we are seeing a lot of other situations as well, in the case of a hostel and allied services, where the West Bengal Authority for Advanced Ruling has gone on to rule that mixed supply of lodging, food and laundry are independent supplies. Now, it may be independent supplies, but when they are done in a sort of one unified sort of arrangement, and perhaps the billing is separate or not separate, would it not then require to be carefully considered and seen as to whether it is a composite supply? There are certain other transactions or situations one could talk about, is when there is an over-dimensional cargo which is being moved or which is being transported from the port to the site. And in the context of the transportation, a development activity of certain part of the road would be needed, or a construction of a little jetty or a bridge would be needed, and which is then equally dismantled and or demolished thereafter. What would then be the nature of this activity? Could it qualify as a composite supply, assuming that I have one unified price, assuming I don't have a unified price? In certain other situations, we would see for example, a water treatment plant being provided by an entity to others, and whether this has the flavor of being immovable in nature, and if yes, then would it then be qualifying for the lower rate in terms of the government transactions if the government is on the other side? And if not, what would be the sort of things we would need to consider to say that this is a composite supply and it is immobile, so we would apply the rate for a works contract for a composite supply. And if not, then really would we come out and then become a mixed supply? Would then we become a line by line item to be taxed? These are all points which open themselves up as one goes about seeing different type of transactions, different type of contracting taking place, and then you have sort of an outcome on the tax position. We've also, of course, seen the view which was taken in the solar power related issues in Giriraj Renewables, where the advanced ruling body has gone on to say in Maharashtra that all works contracts are not composite supplies. Now, it's quite remarkable that such a conclusion could be made, but these are issues which one has to face when one goes into the advanced ruling body. Ritesh, would you just take the connected slide? So okay, so while we get the slide on, the point was that connected with the composite and works contract related issues is that there are contracts which are then taken up with government, where we have a situation where uh, the exemption is given or there's a sort of beneficial rate, and as a service provider there may not be available the answers in terms of what is the pure service, what is the local authority or body, and what is his nature, and whether that should sort of have a lower rate or not. And these are the sort of issues which are coming in and day out, and one doesn't really have a clear guidance and sort of parameters which one can apply and go on into the taxability of these transactions. Picking up on the next one, we have taxability of damages or liquidated damages, amount paid for that. And the often asked questions, especially now in these post-pandemic and COVID times, is that whether it's a case for agreeing to an obligation, to refrain from an act, or to tolerate an act or a situation, or to do an act. Once again, a concept borrowed from our service tax law, but there is a lot of debate that can sort of go around on this issue. And as was expected, the advanced rulings truly are going in the direction which is adverse to the taxpayer. However, there are certain concepts which one must have sort of appreciation of, and then sort of understand the implications for your own transaction. So the couple of points is that when you are paying damages or you are paying liquidated damages, it is a retributive and a compensatory act. It is not a situation where you are actually engaged in making a supply or where reciprocal promises are taking place. As a contractor party or a supplier party, if there is a difficulty or there is a gap and therefore there is a amount payable which has the nature of liquidated damages, you are effectively making good that shortage in the sort of supply that you have to make. So what do we have is that there is no concept intended, at least between the parties, for making a supply. It's a condition of the contract that you would undertake to make good the damages caused or incurred, and that would have a monetary sort of value attributed, which is paid out. Now, we've had the Australian Tax Office in way back in 2001 and 2003 as well say that these amounts should not be liable. The United Kingdom HMRC has also equally clarified. We have certain other decisions from the CESTAT, which in whether it is Amit Metallics or in KN Foods or whether it is in Lemon Tree, have gone on to say that for a non-performance, there cannot be a levy of service tax. This is, of course, in the context of Section 66E, the equivalent of what you have in 5E of Schedule 2 here. In KN Foods, there was certain amount of ex gratia paid for damages, and again, it was held it is not liable. And then in Lemon Tree, quite interestingly, we've had a verdict which says that when there was a cancellation fee which was paid, and it was essentially meant to be sort of compensating for a booking which was not carried through for a hotel, then in that case, there cannot be a levy of service tax in that situation. Now, all of these are much recent sort of judicial pronouncements out of the SESTAT. But we have, of course, in the advanced ruling between Northern Coal and Maharashtra State Power Genco and Rashtriya Ispat, and of course, you're also seeing on your screen Zevar Shankarlal, Bhanushali, etc., which have gone on into sort of the other direction. Now, what is seminal in this situation is the verdict which has been pronounced by the Bombay High Court in the Bai Mamubai Trust. And while this is in an interesting sort of situation in which it all came up, the sort of salient parts of that decision are possibly contained in three sort of points which say that there should not be a levy of GST. So one is that it's a wrongful unilateral act in the context of which a compensation is paid. The second point is that it's a balancing of equities. So it's not that parties intended to supply anything or intended for any supply, but it's the balancing of these equities. The third, and this is also quite important, is that there is no enforceable reciprocal obligation. And if there is no enforceable reciprocal obligation, then really the question of supply doesn't arise. And so they went on to hold that the doctrine of supply does not encompass a wrongful unilateral act which results in payment of damages. So not every situation would be amenable to being taxed under the agreeing to the obligation to refrain from an act or to tolerate an act or a situation or to do an act. Yes, you may seek to stretch it and apply it, but truly now the principles laid down in Bai Mamubai Trust and of course these other SESTAT pronouncements would be of great assistance in coming to the conclusion that these amounts should not suffer GST. Of course, facts will have to be seen in each case, but this is again a vexed issue, and I suspect that in the times that we are, this is going to come up more often than we otherwise have been talking about. Ritesh, we'll take the next slide. Yeah, so Ritesh touched upon this particular issue and mentioned, that can you have a recovery of interest and can you also go against the sort of person who's taken credit. So just one or two quick points on this one is that recovery and garnishee proceedings, one, that there should be a due process of law. So there should be a quantification, a show cause notice, a sort of determination of an amount being payable. Without an amount being payable, there cannot be a levy of, a collection of that amount. And that's what was said by the High Court in the Mahadev Construction Company, that it cannot be proceeded against for recovery. Equally, in the context of interest, it is clear that without a quantification, so to the point which emerges on interest is that it is automatic, yes, in terms of the way the provisions are. And that's what the Tamil Nadu High Court, the Madras High Court has said. But the moment you say it is automatic, it is not that the levy is then just crystallized. It has to be quantified, the arithmetic has to be worked out, and then only can it truly be said to be automatic. And so what has been held in the LC Infra Projects case is that imposition of interest without issuing a show cause is in the breach of principles of natural justice and should not be sort of proceeded. Now, the last point on this particular issue and slide is that can there be a simultaneous initiation of proceedings against suppliers for payment of tax and on the recipient for reversal of the ITC? So can there be a dual benefit which the government will have in such a situation where the tax was not paid but the credit was taken? So is it not appropriate that only one of them be proceeded against, but in the sort of format of our GST law, the supplier and the buyer or the person who is the recipient would not be able to talk to their relevant authorities on this basis and would therefore be saddled with proceedings at their own end. And this would really result into the government benefiting twice, which was not really the intention in our understanding of these provisions. So this is again something we may see in future. We will have to sort of deal with them as they come. Yeah, we'll just take the next one, please. Yeah, anti-profiteering, a lot of things to talk about. This could itself become a session for itself. But just one or two quick points. We've had 144 orders up until the 26th of July. and 49 of those held that there is no profiteering, and 95 of those held that there is profiteering. Now, we have a case where 1,000+ crores of amount are held to be profiteer. Now, it's quite stark that the authorities' approach, ability, and direction is completely lopsided. While there may be 49 orders which are saying that there is no profiteering, to say that there's 1,000 crore of profiteer amount today, and that's recoverable by the government or recovered in some way, is quite a large number in my understanding. So that's the one thing that was not done right. And so I would say that the design, the implementation of the anti-profiteering, the provisions, the body, the entire concept and scheme of this left far from what it should have been. The other point related to this is that it had a lifeline originally of 2 years, where it was to go on up until 2 years, and then it was then again extended until the November 30th of November 2021. Now, while the provision was introduced, was brought in, was talked about even before GST in some way, the e-flyer that was issued by the government alluded to it being a requirement of the introductory phase. And so it was laudable that they were looking to contain inflation or have consumer protection at the sort of heart of this entire scheme. But today, after 3+ years, really would there be a need for an anti-profiteering provision? And especially when you consider that they do not even provide for an appeal mechanism and remedy, and that there are several repetitions on a variety of points and issues which are now sitting with the High Court for the High Court to sit and resolve. It just leaves open the entire question of whether anti-profiteering's time has come, and it should remain on our statute book and continue to sort of haunt the taxpayers. So that's what I had. Thank you. Neeraj, would you please?
Sure. Thank you, Ranjit. So with this, we come to the COVID-19 and how are things panning out so far as GST is concerned. What are the key aspects that we need to consider, the housekeeping that is required to be done. So if we move on to the next slide, let us look at what are the current realignment that are required. Now, any sales that you make to your customer and your customer is unable to make payment of the consideration, what really happens is that you not only lose out on the consideration, but the GST that you have paid is also becoming a cost. While this has been the scheme so far as indirect tax law is concerned, and if you go back and see even under the excise law times, where the courts have held that excise is applicable on manufacture, and once the manufacturing activity is done, the manufacturer is required to make payment of excise duty, irrespective of whether any consideration has been realized. Having said that, I think looking at the current circumstances, there is a case which should be made out to say that the government should consider the extraordinary circumstances, and where the supplier is unable to recover the consideration, there ought to be some distinction to allow and ensure that the GST that has been paid does not become a cost. In any case, the government is not losing out because the supplier or the customer is not able to take the credit because the payment has not been made. So that is one thing which can be looked at. Matching of credits on a monthly basis. Obviously, a lot of people not able to go to office, not having access to systems is not a feasible option at all. And therefore, one needs to just take stock whether you need to take all credits, whether you are not hitting the 180-day criteria. And again, with the lull in the economic activity, there may not be an output tax which require you to ensure that you take credits and make the payment taxes. So that is something one should be taking into account. Non-fulfillment of export obligation, a lot of relaxations has been provided by the government. So if you have an EPCG license, an obligation to be fulfilled, or an advanced license, time period has been extended. I think as we move along and the situation unfolds, there may be a case for further extensions and further relief which needs to be granted by DGFT. Looking at the way the international commerce is also playing out, a lot of countries still in distress, we'll have to see whether more relaxation would be required. If you don't receive the foreign currency, there is a time period prescribed for export of services. Again, that needs to be looked at, and due consideration should be given so that it doesn't become a taxable transaction. In these extraordinary times, a lot of supplier vendors may get into liquidation. So while IBC as a provision has been deferred, by more than a year, but it is likely that it may go beyond a year. And how do you deal with that situation where you have made payment to your supplier and vendor and the tax has not been paid? And as Ranjit was picking up on that point to say that since the supplier has not deposited the tax, you are deprived of the credit of the tax amount, although the same has been paid to the supplier. Again, something which should be looked into. There could be a fallout on a lot of contracts that has been entered in the past. Let's say an SVP order which has been obtained based on certain economic realities, they may undergo a change. They may undergo a change because of a change in economic equations. So how will you deal with that? How will you deal with it along with the transfer pricing provisions? There could be an additional receipt that you may receive from a parent company, let's say if you're a subsidiary, to cover the losses. How will you deal with that? Is that something which is going to be a subject to GST? There are transactions where the royalty could be suspended or waived off. Being related party transactions, how will you deal with those situations? So a lot of these issues, I think, are now going to unfold, and one needs to think through and maybe make representations to the government so that the company does not end up paying taxes or let's say saddled with a liability. A lot of the pain that we are seeing right now may be forgotten 4 years down the line when the assessments etc. will be picked up. And therefore it is important that while this is alive in the memory, all the due amendments or relaxation should be properly accounted for. Litigation and hearing is not happening while efforts are being taken to ensure that there is a WhatsApp hearing or over a WebEx call, but there is going to be a delay, and then one needs to take a call as to whether you would want to go ahead with an e-hearing or you still believe that a physical hearing will have a better impact, and therefore one should actually wait till the time that things normalize and you're able to do a physical hearing. There have been extension of limitation period so far as filing of appeal or filing any reply is given, and therefore that should be taken into account. Moving on, cash is king. If you look at the next slide, which is talking about optimization of tax cash flows. At the current circumstances, it can't be any more truer than it had been earlier. So how do you really ensure that you have a better cash flow? Look at whether any refund application which is to be filed for want of data, can you expedite that? Can you prioritize that and ensure that you file the export application, export refund claims and claim and pursue with the government? The government is also looking at favorable lenses and looking to dispose of the refund claims as early as possible. So make use of this opportunity to ensure that the money comes back to the company. Various schemes benefit like SEIS, MEIS, which are there. Again, look to fast track. So if you're taking 6 months to file the refund claim or a policy claim, maybe you can look at filing at an earlier date and look to encash those benefits. There are contracts where a payment milestone is fixed. Now, can you really amend those contracts so that the tax doesn't become payable in case of a continuous supply of services? And depending on the contractual situation and how the work has been performed, again, those are the things which will depend on case-to-case basis, but those are things which should be borne in mind, and we should see if there is any optimization that can be done so far as tax cash flow is concerned. Now coming to the last slide, what are the compliance requirements that needs consideration? So while the law was amended to say that if you do not file GST returns for 2 months consecutively, the e-way bill mechanism will not operate, it will be blocked. The government has practically not implemented it in these times. However, it would be appropriate if the rules are amended to say that even if if the returns are not filed, e-way bill mechanism will not be blocked, and this will continue till the time the situation normalizes. Then we had this entire timeline of implementing the e-invoicing and simplified returns, which got shifted to October 2020. But my suspicion is, looking at the current scenario, there is going to be a pushback, and it may go to a January 21 or an April 21 deadline. One of the fallout of low tax collection could be that there could be an aggressive follow from tax authorities to increase the tax collections as soon as the situation normalizes. So this is something which we all should be aware of, and ideally prepare in anticipation that lot of records, lot of data will be asked by the authorities. So can we prepare in advance so that we are able to face them and answer any of those queries? Because as soon as situation normalizes, I think there is going to be a lot of pressure from the tax authorities to increase the tax collection. So the GST audit date, annual return filing date for the financial year has been extended to 30th September 2020. As things will pan out, we need to see whether those dates will further need an extension, because if things don't stabilize and people are not able to go to office in full strength, there may be a need to actually further extend this date. Pending assessments under VAT, it has been kind of put in storage right now because nothing is moving. But again, that is something which is going to pick up speed in next coming months, and that is something which the authorities will again may get aggressive to shore up the tax collections. So with this, we wanted to sum up of the entire 3-year journey. What are the issues that we have been facing, and how do we deal with the current situation in COVID-19? We'd like to thank you all for your participation, and if there are any questions, we can take them up.
Thank you very much, sir. Questions are already there in the question box. I think Ritesh again pick up.
Yeah. So there are certain. Yeah. Yeah. So I will just read out the questions quickly, and I will try and answer them or request my partner colleagues to answer. So the first question is, if any software license is imported from outside India, is it treated as services or goods, and this service license import through electronically can sell to the customer and vice versa? See, with respect to taxability of software, whether they are goods or services, under the GST regime, if there is no import on a physical media and they are downloaded, then they would constitute as services. However, there are also valuation provisions under custom which says that which is for condition of sale, that if the import is a condition of sale of any goods which are being imported. So a machinery, a laptop which is imported, let's say with a integrated Microsoft Office software, then those would become goods and liable to tax as GST. However, there is also an issue of levy of GST under reverse charge as services. There is an exemption which has been granted for license fees, where if you pay custom duty, GST would not be applied. So normally a software download would be treated as services. However, also that a credit can be taken for such downloads. The second question that I have on my screen is, a customer, so just a minute. Yeah, so it says, if a customer outside India but availing renting service on immobile property within India, our supplier of service in India treated in GST, will it come under forward charge RCM? Now the immobile property is in India and it is a location-based service. So if it is a location-based service, the supplier has to charge GST. And if the customer is outside India, he would not be able to take credit and GST would become covered. The third issue is, you mentioned about 3 years of GST system and errors not getting resolved. Neeraj, you've spoken about the journey of GST and the GST and failure in terms of system issues. And there's somebody who is asking us that still my errors are not getting resolved. No quick answers. You want to just comment on that?
No, I think that's a reality. That there are issues still we are grappling with the system.
Hello?
I think one of the
sorry, let me just then take this up. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think there have been frequent changes. If you see new things are being implemented, and the and the time period that is required for any system related changes to settle down, I think we are still coping up with that mechanism and struggling to match the speed. As we look at it, I think this is likely to continue for some more time, till the time the new e-invoicing or online matching system is implemented. and it will have a life of its own. These things are unlikely to go away. We have seen, the companies which are implementing GST being pulled up, etc. So say that why these issues are not being resolved, they've been taken to the High Court as well. But be that as it may, I guess we'll have to live with it till the time the situation and the system stabilizes.
Thank you. The next question is imposing 28% GST in this COVID-19 situation is justifiable? See, when GST had initially been contemplated, the GST was applicable, 28% was applicable on a lot many items. And now this 28% is applicable on a very, very few. Yes, whether or not 28% would continue in the future is of course a question mark. So certain items, for sure, it would continue. Like for example, beverages, etc. This is to our view, considering that it is on a very, very few items, and they are considered as luxury items. Obviously, one point of contention is cement. Is it a luxury item, and whether 28% should continue? There was a principal agreement to say that cement should not be in a 28% bracket, but because of the revenue implications, the government has not decided to move on. So I would say there is no wrong or right answer at this stage, just that because there is a COVID, whether the rate should be brought. It may be a temporary relief that the government can grant, but this has to be also balanced with the revenue considerations of the government. The economic activity is not happening. The revenues have fallen down substantially. We do not see, today that the government is willing to offer any kind of a rate concession. The other question is around, GST being a new tax, and there are offences, criminal offences, which are, the penalty is arrest, and whether it is justified to have these. Ranjit, you want to share your views on this in terms of, the prosecution provisions which are there under GST. Are they fair and reasonable in today, considering that it has just been 3 years of GST?
Yeah, so Ritesh, I think we can all sort of sit here and debate whether it is fair or not. The reality is that there is a great deal of sort of fraudulent activity, and clearly that results in leakage of revenues, which the government cannot afford. So you will have sort of stringent measures and provisions which are inserted, and they're rightfully there for those sort of situations. Now, the point is that the authorities or the officers on the ground, or what we call the field formations, they should be sort of maybe tutored, in a way of speaking, to ensure that they apply these provisions not in a sort of all cases and situations, but in a case which is grave, in a case which is truly a fraudulent activity has taken place after due investigation, and not in a hasty sort of laissez-faire manner. So that's the way in which I would believe it could be balanced out. The provisions must exist in the statute book for the cases which are severe and have to be dealt with with an iron fist. The rest of them, the authorities must be far more accommodating, especially given that it's a new law which is introduced.
Thank you, Ranjit. The next question is, can GST, which can take care of different rates being prevalent? You spoke about open railway tender, 5%, 12%, 18%. See, we need to understand that the 5% rate or the 12% or the 18% rate are concessional rates, sometimes which are conditional upon satisfaction of certain, prior conditions. So, for example, government contracts where the services are provided to government for a particular type of service. Then there are exemptions for pure services. There are exemptions for services where material value is less than 25%. So the different rates could actually be because of how the tender or the contract is. What is the intent and purpose? What is the quantum of material versus labor involved, etc. So whether it is composite or split. So a lot of factors would actually come into play. There cannot be two different rates for the same item unless there is a concession exemption, and which is subject to some conditionality which has to be fulfilled. So you have to really look at whether they're entitled to any such concession or exemption because of which they're entitled to become a known rate of tax. The next question is refund of accumulated credit as invoicing has ceased. On a very substantive basis, once you exported, you ought to be entitled to refund. The way the formula works today is that the refund is only available if you have an export from that particular state. Maybe a point of dispute where you can take this up. I don't think the authorities would agree, but probably the only approach would be maybe filing a petition to say that, because I've already done an export, why should I not be granted credit? But unfortunately, formalize the problem. The next question is, client has two GSTNs, and it seems that the GSTN 1 was not filed correctly, and for 17, 18, 18, 19, the amendments have closed. Yes, this is an issue. The amendments have already closed. You cannot amend the returns. For 17, 18, even annual returns have been filed. One approach could be for 18, 19 is that let the vendor disclose the tax in the right manner in the annual returns. The customer will take credit because he has the documentation available. And if tomorrow there is a dispute of the department, let the customer take the copy of the documents from the supplier, which proves that the tax has been paid. And then it has to be fought on a fundamental basis. The system won't allow you to make any amendment now. The amendments have closed. So it can only be done by a mechanism of documentation. The next question is, failed or obsolete items, are we supposed to take credit? So the credit rules basically do not allow you credit for goods which are lost, stolen, destroyed or disposed of as free goods. Now, failed or obsolete items, I don't know what is the status. So is it like they have been used and then it has become failed or obsolete, or is it that the moment you've taken it, it has become failed and obsolete and not been used? If you are anyways returning it, the credit will have to be reversed. But if you have, let's say, used the item for a considerable period of time, and now you want to sort of destroy it, the provisions are not very clear in terms of under what mechanism would you reverse that credit, because they've already been used. In fact, there are judgments in the excise regime which says that in the context of capital goods destroyed by fire, which says that if you have used the capital goods and then subsequently they have got destroyed by fire, you cannot reverse the credit, because at the point in time you've taken them, you already used them. So how would you now reverse the credit, on what basis, and what credit would you reverse? You will have to see, we'll have to understand what is when you say failed or obsolete, what does it mean? So it is failed or obsolete after used. And again, one of the aspects is whether you're going to write it off in the books of accounts, because one of the provisions also says that if you write off in the books of account, you'll have to reverse. But again, question is what mechanism? There is the next question of notification 12/2007 is optional or compulsory. Now, there is a section 11 provision which says that if it is a conditional exemption, then it could be optional. Otherwise, it is compulsory. Now, in certain cases like restaurant, for example, they have specifically said that it is mandatory and not optional. Now, here I understand that this is unconditional exemption, so it will be hit by the provision. I don't know what is the nature of service, but if it is RCM, yes, you can pay and take credit, provided you satisfy the conditions of section 17. The next question is interpretation of full credit. So what do you mean by full credit? Again, again, it's a debated issue. So as you know, under section 17, you have the hybrid method of taking credit. Now, let us say I transfer credit to my branch, and for that particular goods, I am able to take full credit. Does it mean it is full credit? Let us say there is some reversal of credit on account of common services. Now, would you then say that I am eligible to take full credit? One of the clear interpretation views, and which is quite a strong view, is to say that on the goods that am I transferring, whether I am eligible to take credit. Neeraj, Ranjit, you want to add on this? We have discussed this in the past in terms of what do you mean by full credit.
No, sure. If one makes a logical deduction of what the intent of law is to say that if there is a branch transfer transaction and there is going to be a payment of tax when the branch is selling to the customer, is there a need to question the valuation between branch A and branch B? Because whatever tax branch A will discharge, branch B will get the credit. If that be the case, then there is no need to really litigate on what should be the right value. And that is the intent and spirit behind the insertion of this provision. Now, if we look at the spirit and intention behind this provision, then the concept of full credit should be viewed from the perspective of the goods that are being transferred to the branch, and not look at the entire branch to say that whether they are also into exempt supplies, whether there are some other reversals happening. I think that is how we believe we should look at it.
No, completely agree, Neeraj. So it has to be looked into the context of the goods that are being transferred, and not on an overall scenario where you might have some reversals at the branch level. The next question, again, an interesting question on advance ruling. No precedent value. Why is there much reliance upon these things? The entire conceptualization of the advance ruling was that it would clarify doubts and it would settle litigation. Unfortunately, the way advance rulings have gone ahead, it has created more litigation than resolving it, and we all know about it. So, when you say why is it being relied, so first of all, the fundamental principle is that advance ruling is only applicable to the applicant. The issue is that they are being relied upon as some persuasive value, but it doesn't lay down the law, at least for other taxpayers who are not part of that application. So, irrespective of what the advance ruling says, you can dispute the position. The challenge is they are being relied upon by the department to raise issues, raise notices. That is what is creating a larger problem. If you talk about the taxpayer, obviously, if an advance ruling is negative, like the recent advance ruling on director remuneration, again, opened up a Pandora's box in terms of employee director. And immediately there was a clarification, which overrides now the advance ruling. So you will have to go by the law which is applicable to you, not rely upon the advance ruling because it is not applicable to you. But yes, you just need to keep in mind that department may refer to them and issue notices upon you. That's the only point where you need to ensure your house is in order, your documentation, your legal arguments are in order. The next question is, petroleum products. What are the factors responsible for not including petroleum products? I think it is clearly an issue of revenue, because petroleum products constitute a large portion of revenue of the state governments. And the way GST Council now operates is that it has to bring both the center and the state on board. And unless all the states agree to this is very unlikely to happen. And considering the current COVID scenario, where revenue itself is a big question mark, this is of course going to be some time before we have petroleum products under the GST. Unfortunately, it is not because of there being any logic as to why this should not be included. This is more of a, I would say, a political discussion in terms of how states can be brought on board and how this can be included. The next question is service export and TDS in the foreign country, and the receipt is only the net portion. Fundamentally, Ranjit, Neeraj, if you want to just take up any of those questions. So what it says is service export of rupees 100 and TDS has been deducted in the foreign country at rupees 10. So what I receive is only 90. So what would be my export turnover for the purposes of refund under 89? 100 or 90? So yeah, Ranjit, you want to take the?
Yeah, so convertible foreign exchange, that's what we need to collect. I think maybe this is a sort of an untested situation. The sort of position that will need to be established is that what was retained at source in terms of withholding in the other jurisdiction was but a sort of application of law which was there and which could not be escaped. So, but for that, it would have been paid. And in a manner of speaking, as we would say in India, that you withheld taxes at source, and instead of paying it to the sort of person to whom the monies are owed, you pay it to the government in a deduction format at source. Much the same logic will have to be established here. Now, it will be a sort of position to establish. Like I said, there isn't a clear-cut provision or precedent which can be applied. And I think whatever material in terms of law and what is applicable in that other jurisdiction should be brought to the table, and in fact also placed before the authority and the Reserve Bank, so that that sort of position is very clearly documented.
Yeah, absolutely. Ranjit. In fact, just to add, there is this concept of deemed to be received in convertible foreign exchange. I think there is a decision in the pre-GST regime, which is, I think, is KC Botha, where this concept was recognized. And even under the GST regime, in the context of projects, they have recognized this concept of deemed to be received in foreign exchange. So all those points will probably have to be brought on board to argue that my export revenue is 100, not 90, and therefore that should be considered export revenue.
Correct.
So Ranjit, the next question is anti-profiteering provisions. So whether can anti-profiteering provisions be invoked against the rubber board, which has continued licensing at 4 to 5 times the erstwhile fee for rubber procurement, even after subsuming of rubber cess into GST, and asking for such inflated fees to be paid for 5 years in advance, which was never the case in pre-GST.
Ritesh, I'm not too confident of this being an anti-profiteering question. Maybe it's purely contractual, or in this case, maybe a licensing term. So I think we should, take that offline if necessary.
Yeah, yeah. No, so absolutely. Yeah, so Ranjit, what it appears is that this is a licensing fee which the rubber board might be charging for procurement of rubber, which could be a controlled commodity. And it doesn't seem to be like an anti-profiteering question, because anti-profiteering applies to the products or not to the fees. That is what it also appears to be. Absolutely.
Yeah.
The next question is, anybody who wants to take it up is Neeraj, if you want to take it up, what will be the current status on GST payable under RCM for ocean freight by considering the Gujarat High Court decision, so which is the Mohit Minerals case?
So the Mohit Mineral case dealt with the provisions under the GST law, which has been amended. So what the GST law provided, that you can nominate a recipient of service to be the person who is liable to pay service tax, and based on those that particular provision, the Gujarat High Court decided that if I am not the recipient of the service, and these contract is between two parties who are outside India, then the Indian importer cannot be saddled with the liability of reverse charge mechanism. Now those provisions have undergone a change, and the law can require a person other than a recipient of service to be the person liable to pay tax. With this change in of a particular aspect, probably the ruling which has been given may not apply. However, one could also look at the fact that similar provisions were there in the service tax law, and basis certain grounds where the court say that the valuation mechanism is not feasible, etc. The Indian importer may not be required to pay tax. So one can perhaps rely on those arguments to take a position, but it is definitely going to be litigated and unlikely to be settled before the Supreme Court.
In fact, yeah, just to add, what I understand is even under GST, this has been challenged, though the decision is not out. And the other, again, one of the issues is that if practically you are eligible to take credit, people are not getting into this debate of whether payable or not payable. I think the larger issue is whether an importer can be the recipient or not in terms of the GST law. I think that is what we have to just wait and see. As I said, till that time, the issue would be under a limbo. So you may sort of pay under protest and file an immediate refund claim, because the time limit of refund is also 2 years. filing refund
Absolutely.
claims also.
Absolutely.
Means,
The
now
other question, next question is applicability of GST on amount debited to the customer due to non-filing of return. Yeah. The next question is applicable. Yeah, Vinay.
yes, I think it's the last. We can take the last question, then we'll need to wrap it up. Yeah, it should be last questions.
Yeah, sure. So we just the last question, which finally, and if you have any additional queries, please do feel free to write to us. So the last question is applicability of GST and amount debited to customer due to non-filing of return. Is there any chance of Schedule 2 tolerating an act? The answer would be no, but I think the key question is once you debit the vendor, would you also reverse your credit? Because then there is a double benefit. So A, that you are debiting the vendor for the amount. B, you are also not reversing the credit. That could create a problem in terms of a double advantage being taken because the vendor is not paid. You already debited the vendor account and you are still continuing with the. I don't think so. This would be considered as a tolerant act because with the amendment under Section 7(1)(a), there has to be first a supply. And when you talk about debiting the vendor, it is the vendor providing you the services. You are not providing any supply of services to the vendor. So I don't think so there would be any liability. The issue would be a reversal of credit when you debit the vendor. That would be the larger. So Avinash, we can now close the session. Just over to you.
Yes, thank you very much, sir. So this brings us to this end of this very informative webinar. So on behalf of SHM, I would like to convey my sincere thanks to all three experts, Mr. Ritesh Kanodia, Mr. Neeraj Bagri, and Mr. Rajit Mehtani, for their valuable time and sharing their important views with the participants. I would like to inform the participant that we will share the presentation in the PDF format tomorrow afternoon. And in case you have any query, you can write to the experts. So I would like to convey my sincere thanks to all the attendees for participating in this webinar. And now with this, we are closing the session. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.